Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Belinda Carr Show. Today, we're going to be talking about hyperinflation and the general economics of the construction industry. So, in September of last year, I released a video on hyperinflation and labor shortages in the construction industry because it was on everyone's mind. It was the major concern, and it still is. But the video got a lot of positive responses and some excellent, insightful comments too.
Yeah, I was surprised that it didn't get more views actually, because it was a trending topic last year with the way inflation was going through the roof and futures prices. I mean, how many people have you ever heard talk about lumber futures before?
Yeah, it's probably the thumbnail or the title. It wasn't clickbaity enough.
There were a lot of interesting comments from that video, and one of them stuck out to me that someone said that they're finding that contractors only want to hire young people. Rarely do they see job sites where there are older people, more experienced people. And that's kind of concerning because the younger people have less experience and they're more likely to hop to another job, especially the way that the construction industry is being paid right now.
There are far more exciting things to do out there, and mentalities have changed among our generation. We no longer feel the need to stay with one company and for decades and devote ourselves to growing it. We see if there are other opportunities out there, we go and take it.
Something else that has piled onto this labor shortage is baby boomers retiring. I mean, the baby boomer generation is the largest generation in history until the millennial generation. Baby boomers are at that age where they're starting to retire rapidly. And the pandemic seemed to just accelerate that. And I think that's a factor that is definitely added to the labor shortages in the construction industry.
Like, we saw this coming for so long. We knew the number of people in the construction industry that were baby boomers. We knew when they were going to retire. We knew we were going to have this issue.
Baby boomers were retiring in not just the construction industry, but all industries. I read an interesting book a few years back called Upside, Profiting from the Profound Demographic Shifts Ahead. He's a demographer, so he just puts numbers to everything. And it was really interesting to see the trends that he could predict.
Yeah, and there were companies out there that tried to get ahead of it with automation. But when you're in it, human beings are procrastinators. Whether we run a business or we don't, we're all procrastinators. We have been pushing this, so what do they call it, kicking the can down the road, saying we'll deal with this issue when the time comes. Companies didn't invest in automation in the future generation, and they still relied so heavily on manual labor, on baby boomers. And when the pandemic hit and labor shortages and shutdowns, all that stuff, everything happened much earlier than expected, and everything happened at once.
So the pandemic was unprecedented. The way the economy shut down was unprecedented. So every event that has happened after that is under this umbrella of an unprecedented event. We don't have any sort of formula of what we can look to as an example for what the future might hold.
So a couple of days ago, I spoke to Ken Simonson again, who is the chief economist of the AGC, or Associated General Contractors of America. I asked him about the current health of the construction economy and his outlook for the rest of the year. So today we have Ken Simonson, chief economist of the AGC, or the Associated General Contractors of America. Nice to meet you again, Ken.
Good to be with you.
So we spoke in August of last year when I was making a YouTube video on inflation, or hyperinflation. And a lot of things have changed since then. But before we get into it, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how long you've been with the AGC?
Sure. Well, first, let me say a little about AGC. It's the leading national construction trade association with over 27,000 member companies that do every kind of construction other than single-family home building. We have about 6,500 general contractors, and then the rest of the members include subcontractors of every type and also suppliers of goods and services. And I've been with AGC as their chief economist for 20 years now. So I've really seen the ups and also some steep downs in construction. And right now, I think we're on the cusp of a big upturn.
So the last time we spoke, we were still in the middle of the pandemic. And now, fortunately, we're seeing some signs of the end of the pandemic coming close, how have things changed over the last 6 months or so? Just like a general overview of the construction industry, the health of the industry.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that have changed. First, at the time we talked before, every material seemed to be going up, many to record prices. And since then, we've seen some big price breaks, but we've also seen some of those move up again recently after having come down. So we're entering a period of greater volatility. And certainly we've seen that lately with the stock market also within a single day, huge swings. And then in terms of construction activity, residential had been on the up and up straight through both single and multifamily. Those are continuing, although they've moderated somewhat. But the non-residential side had been pretty weak. Now we're seeing more categories of non-residential move forward.
So you mentioned, or you alluded to lumber. It had been spiking last year. We saw a little bit of a break, and now it's rising again. And steel has continued to rise and has shown no signs of coming back down. What do you think is causing those two behaviors?
Well, first, let me say there is some positive from a buyer standpoint indications on steel. At the mill level, there's a widely watched index from Steel Market Update, and their price for hot rolled coil dropped more than 20% from early September to early January. And many steel analysts are expecting further descent over the next several months. And that's partly because steel capacity is starting to catch up. And also, I think demand weakened somewhat because the automakers just weren't able to finish vehicles. So they've cut back production. And of course, autos and light trucks are huge users of steel. The construction demand for steel does remain, well, I would say it is strengthening. But at any rate, that's one reason that you're seeing various price movements is the end user markets are changing in different ways. But the overall explanation that applies in some degree to almost every material is the effects of COVID. At the beginning of the pandemic, you had so many businesses cancel orders or have to close down if they weren't deemed essential, or they couldn't get a full workforce together. And then demand surged as people who were stuck at home started ordering lots of goods. As businesses reopened, not every business clearly, but many of them started to want more materials. And yet the factories or the plants, the mills, they weren't necessarily able to get back to full production. They had workers who were sick or had to take care of someone who was. And then also we've seen huge breakdown in the transportation part of the supply chain. There aren't enough truck drivers, there aren't enough rail cars, there aren't enough chassis to put the containers on that are landing at the port. So you have this huge backlog of ships offshore. You have containers stacked up, filling every square inch of the ports. And so these things are all causing a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability as to when you will get a delivery, whether it's a load of lumber, a set of appliances to finish off an apartment building, or a generator for a factory.
So you touched on a lot of things over there. So one of them was the supply chain issues. You've seen ships backed up, like you said, and so has there been any progress over the last 2 months with the backlog out on the West Coast?
I am told that there is progress on certain backlogs, but we keep running into new hurdles, or in some cases, it's like a traffic jam that you move forward and then the next spot you run into another delay. So I can't say that things have gotten steadily better in any particular area. And I think that the lesson that we've learned over the last 2 years is to expect the unexpected, whether it's a ship blocking the Suez Canal for 6 days of all things, or a freeze affecting all of the plants in Texas that produce the plastic resins that go into so many construction plastics. Just lots of unusual, maybe even unprecedented events. And they have wider impacts and longer lasting impacts than we might have seen a few years ago because the whole supply chain has really been stretched thin to the breaking point. And again, that's partly because of COVID leaving production levels lower, uncertainty about whether you'll get the staffing at any point in the chain.
So you think while we're dealing with all these things, we still need to strengthen the backbone of like the supply chain and rethink the way it is? Is it outdated and hasn't caught up to modern times?
There's certainly some of that. When we look at US ports and compare them to ports in other countries, there's a lot more automation in those ports and the ability to move containers at any hour of the day or night, much more so than in the US. We also impose a lot of rules that make our supply and transportation network less efficient than it might be. For instance, there's a 100-year-old law called the Jones Act that says anything moved from one place in the US to another by ship, the ship has to be a US built, owned, and staffed by American crews. And there just aren't many shipbuilders here. There aren't many American crews. And so this greatly limits the number of ships available, hugely drives up the cost. And there are just a lot of examples in terms of regulation or customs that keep us from being as efficient as we might be. In fact, if I can recommend a book to your listeners, I just finished a book called Arriving Today by a Wall Street Journal columnist named Christopher Mims. And he does a wonderful job of explaining in a lot of short, simple, but not dumbed down chapters, each stage of the supply chain, how it has evolved over time, what the obstacles are now. And I think it really improved my understanding.
Is there a particular country we can look to that has been developing their supply chain and has put a lot of money into automating their processes?
Well, there are definitely quite a few ports around the world that have more automation at the port. In terms of other parts of our supply chain, I think the US is unique in having such a large territory and so much moving by truck. But we also have quite a robust rail network. And of course, we have privately owned railroads. So they are responsible for investment and upgrade on their track and on getting the staffing right. And over the last few years, they've evolved the way they dispatch and staff trains. That initially, the switch over to that precision railroading, as they call it, where they were running trains on a regular schedule, whether they were full or not, as opposed to waiting until they had a full enough train, that caused some problems in terms of deliveries. But I think ultimately it's probably proving its worth, but there's still disruption.
So you mentioned labor shortages with truckers. And do you think there are other jobs out there that are far more enticing and that's what they have moved to?
Yes, in fact, one of the impacts of the pandemic probably is that people who had that commercial driver's license, had the experience driving a big truck, suddenly they saw that they could get a job doing local deliveries, that there was so much more demand for that last mile that they could get home every night, not have to deal with the surly shipping managers or crews to unload a big tractor trailer delivering packages or food was an easier way to make a living. So I think that's one thing that has cut into the supply of long haul truck drivers. Also, you'll recall that back in early first half of 2020, we had a lot of businesses shut down, and that included truck driving schools. Now, often someone can get a commercial driver's license in just 6 weeks, but to have those schools closed during that period meant for a time there wasn't even a supply of new truck drivers coming along. And that industry has a huge turnover rate. So they do depend on a continuous supply of new drivers, and that added to the shortages there.
Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't think about that. So I know the federal minimum wage hasn't increased, but we have seen wage increases across the board just because companies are desperate to hire workers. What has the construction industry also done the same?
Well, construction pay is going up a good deal faster than it did over the last decade, but it's not keeping up with those really dramatic examples that you may have seen in a fast food window, or seen a news account of how fast food warehouse, local delivery, they're offering $15 or $17 starting pay, and also signing bonuses or retention bonuses. And then there are other jobs that suddenly you can do them from home, or on a hybrid basis, or you can vary your hours. Well, that's not possible on a construction job site. You have to be there with the full crew the whole time, whatever the weather. And historically, construction made up for that by offering quite a bit more than the average for all industries. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, as part of that monthly employment report, puts out a figure called average hourly earnings for what they call production non-supervisory employees. And that would basically mean the trades workers in construction. And that gap, construction paid a premium of 20 to 23% right through the 2006 up through 2019. Suddenly that gap has dropped to just about 17%. So construction really has not kept up. And the implication is that contractors are going to have to pay a lot more to get workers to come, to keep workers, or they're going to be paying a lot more in overtime for the workers they still have.
So the one thing that everyone is concerned about right now is inflation. So we've seen monthly inflation go from around 2 to 7% just in 2021. And the Fed forecasts 3 to 4 interest rates hikes this year. What does that mean for the construction industry as a whole that's already operating on such small profit margins?
Yeah, construction firms were definitely caught by surprise, as most of us were, by the steep increases in costs and the persistence that we kept hearing that inflation was going to be transitory. Well, there was no definition on when that would end, but it certainly has lasted longer than either the Fed or most of us economists had expected, and has stayed higher. But I do think we'll gradually get prices coming back down. We've already seen, as I mentioned, drop in steel prices at the earliest stage. It may not have shown up in the steel products that contractors are buying, but I think that the burner has been turned off under those prices. And we've seen a couple of big price drops in lumber. Yes, it's come back, but it's not close to the record high that it set last summer, and so forth with some other things. So I think while we'll have a lot of volatility this year, and that's dangerous in itself, we're no longer going to see the continuous escalation in costs that we had before.
Is there a reason why lumber has started to trend upwards again? I know the several.
I am told it's partly because of supply problems coming out of British Columbia, that they had devastating fires at record heat last summer. And following fires, once you get rain, you get mudslides. So again, they've had difficulty harvesting the timber or getting it to the mills, getting stuff out of their own lumber mills, and then across the border. And there are problems at times with the truck drivers being able to come across the border. So it's at the earliest stage of the supply chain that you see that fallback in production. But conversely, there are other times when wholesalers hold off, or the demand from home builders is not as strong as it had been. And then you get the dramatic price drops because people had been counting on ever higher prices. So lumber is certainly one of the most volatile products out there.
So oil is now at a 4-year high. And with all these rising energy costs, are people in the construction industry finally being interested in renewable energy?
Oh, construction
Yeah.
firms have certainly been interested in working on renewable projects. And among the big growth areas this year, I think, will be wind and solar, the beginnings of offshore wind off the East Coast. And those kinds of projects require new transmission lines. And they're at such a scale that now they're also requiring vast utility scale battery storage or pump storage, because so much of that wind or solar power is generated in locations and at times of day that they're not being consumed. So you have to have a way of transmitting it and then of storing it. So in terms of opportunity, there's a lot there. And also battery charging stations. It looks like we may have demand for tens of thousands of those. That's an entirely new construction niche. In terms of contractors buying equipment or using methods that rely more on renewable energy, on battery power, and so forth, we're certainly seeing a lot of offerings come forward, but the market has to prove that these actually deliver savings, reliability, quality, and so forth. I would say that contractors are so much more optimistic now about the prospects for almost any category of structure than they were a year ago. AGC of America does a survey every fall, and we just released this in early January, in which for 15 out of 17 project types, we had more firms saying they expect the market to increase than to decrease in 2022. And that was almost an exact reversal of last year. The only ones in which contractors were more pessimistic than optimistic was for retail and private office construction. I think that the medium term looks good, perhaps not quite as good as the contractors believe, but in many cases, they're looking at it from a very low base. So we could see really almost across the board increases this year. For the longer term, I certainly expect the market to evolve in many categories. The distribution, we've already seen the growth of the so-called last mile distribution points, of hybrid stores where you may do some retail shopping yourself, but you can also pick up things that have already been picked for you, or you can have a delivery service bring them to you. And fulfillment centers that are ever bigger or are actually going to 2 levels of truck delivery. We talked about the energy, renewable energy market and how many things that will be changing. Healthcare also, I think, will be moving away from hospitals and more to specialized care facilities. And all of these things will mean we need more manufacturing capacity, in some cases entirely new types of manufacturing. So lots of opportunity, but also some segments going to be left behind.
So when you say new types of manufacturing, do you think there are lots of new people coming into the industry, like questioning the way things were done and looking at a new type of automation, a new type of building, a new type of material to use as well?
There certainly is some of that. I think it's going to be more evolutionary than revolutionary, though.
You think so?
Because construction, by nature, both the industry and its designers and its regulators take a conservative view. You don't want to take a chance with putting up a bridge or a building that is going to collapse and risk killing lots of people or really disrupting traffic flows or the economy and so forth. So we'll be taking things, or companies will be taking things one step at a time, but that doesn't mean they've closed off the chance of innovation. I think we're seeing a great deal of that being tried out and designed for the future.
So if people want to know more about weekly occurrences or weekly trends in the construction industry, I believe they can subscribe to your newsletter.
That's right. I write a weekly one-page summary of economic news relevant to construction called the Data Digest. And people are welcome to sign up for that. Just email me at ken.simonson, SIMONSON, @agc.com.
Thanks so much, Ken, for catching up with me after a couple of months. And I hope we see some positive trends this year and some positive news for the construction industry.
Well, thank you, Belinda, and it's been good talking to you again.
All right. Thank you. See you.
So Ken Simonson had some interesting thoughts. I was particularly interested in his view on the truckers and how that's changed from the last 5 months.
Yeah, because back in September, we were talking about lumber mostly. We weren't talking about the trucker shortages. They were a problem, but it wasn't the number one topic. And a lot has changed since then. What do you think was worse, the Suez Canal or the backlog at the California ports?
I would say the California ports being backed up was a bigger deal. It more directly affected Americans.
But it's not cleared. There's still a backup.
I would say with the Suez Canal, it was something that was
More global.
It was so far out of reach that we couldn't really feel the effects of it. With the ships just offshore, we're starting to realize how directly that is affecting us.
Yeah, because with the Suez Canal, the one ship blocked it, and there were plenty of other ships backed up because of that ship. But once it was cleared, then they were able to pass through. In this case, it's been months now.
The issue is not someone made a bad maneuver. The issue is that we don't have enough people.
It's more like infrastructure issues. So when I was talking to Ken Simonson, I was trying to get to this point where we have to tackle two urgent issues at the same time. One, solve the backlog, which seems almost impossible, and two, fix the root cause of the problem.
And initially, you can't address those both at the same time, which I'm not sure if that's what we're trying to do, but let's at least address one of them.
Can you really, though? Because you can't really fix the problem unless you fix the laws, and we know how long it takes to fix laws and all outdated codes and everything.
That's true. I feel like there's certain things that could be done or that have been done, temporarily lifting certain restrictions to where we can get some of these ports cleared up. I thought one thing that was interesting that Ken Simonson mentioned, anything that's shipped from around the U.S. has to be done in a...
They have to employ Americans. No, the ship has to be American made, and certain percentage of the workers have to be Americans or something like that. That's...
Yeah.
The first issue I thought of when he mentioned that is that when the LA ports were backed up, they were redirecting some of these ships to Seattle. So I didn't know about this clause that he mentioned. So if you unload some of the stuff in Seattle, but you still need to eventually transport some of it to LA, you need to use a different ship. You can't just use the same ship or the same people on the ship.
And it's things like that I feel like could temporarily be lifted while we get this backlog cleaned up.
So in addition to all the backlog of trucks, we've also had a shortage of truckers. They've all just mysteriously vanished.
So one thing Ken mentioned was the idea of this last mile delivery and how companies, all these e-commerce companies, are starting to contract out the last mile of delivery. So whenever you have a package delivered, it's coming from some random car.
So now you're saying that truckers have other options. They don't have to stay away from their families for a whole month, live in their trucks and just put up with a life of discomfort. They can still live in their homes, be around their families, and then just do these last mile deliveries and make the same amount of money.
Yeah, and they don't have to maintain that commercial trucker's license either.
So Ken Simonson also talked about wages, how the construction industry has low wages than other industries. And we have seen this. The fast food industry has really stepped up their game because of the severe lack of workers. You see signs out for like $20 an hour at In-N-Out.
And they also have sign-on bonuses as well.
I know. Whew. I don't think any architecture firm has sign-on bonuses.
I wonder why these companies are able to do this. I understand a company like an Amazon or a Facebook or something, these large tech companies that have a lot of cash at their disposal, they can afford to do this and they can basically buy everyone. But these other companies, these fast food restaurants, the McDonald's and the In-N-Outs and stuff like that, you don't think of those as fast-growing technology companies that have all this money at their disposal.
Do you think the construction industry is more conservative in that way?
Absolutely.
They're more old school.
Yeah, Ken Simonson even mentioned how conservative the construction industry is whenever you talked about new materials. He said, yeah, they're very conservative in that they are looking at these new materials, but it's going to come slow. So I guess construction would be considered a lagging indicator of the economy. So it'll be one of the slower to recover.
There's so many people out there that have identified all these problems in the construction industry, and over the last 2 years, they want to disrupt it. That's the big word right now. Tech is going to disrupt the construction industry. And they come and face all these people and these old school companies that are like, no, we'll show you how slow we can actually move.
Is there an example of another industry that has gone through that phase where they were very unaccepting of change and have now evolved and are much more progressive?
I feel like the agriculture industry, I keep going back to that because I see so many parallels between the agriculture industry and the construction industry, and that mass exodus from the agriculture industry and severe labor shortage caused them to automate. They had to just give up, no more hand tools, and they just innovated, and now almost the entire process is automated.
I feel like automation is the answer in construction.
And the other parallel between agriculture and construction is the dealing with natural elements and Mother Nature and its unpredictability. That is a huge hurdle that they have managed to overcome. It's very impressive. With drones and sensors and soil, like they get into the chemistry of the soil and figure out how to get the output that they need.
I feel like with a construction job site, you could almost remove the elements if you had a big enough indoor dome to cover up your construction site, even if it's like an inflatable dome or something, and then you could have your machines doing all the work without concern for the environment.
So as a general outlook, the industry is trending up, but it's going to be slow, and we're going to have some pullbacks. Like lumber, for example, we've seen a big drop until December, and now we've started climbing up again, but hopefully we don't get to the same highs as earlier last year. Steel has continued to climb, but Ken said cold rolled steel, like the raw material, has dropped dramatically. So in time, he expects the price of steel to level off or come down.
So from a technical standpoint, it seems like we're going to be making these lower highs, or we're going to be in a downtrend from now on. Yeah, sure, there's going to be a lot of volatility, but eventually we'll make our way out of this. So talking about building material costs coming down and that we're actually in this downtrend, that strongly correlates with what the Fed's looking to do this year in raising interest rates. So now there's 6 rate hikes baked in?
6 to 7.
Yeah, for this year alone, and then probably another 3 or 4 next year, which I know to some people interest rate hikes are bad, but it's necessary to curb the crazy inflation we're dealing with right now. Like at the beginning of 2021, we were sitting at around 2% inflation, which is what the Fed's mandate is, to hit about 2% inflation. And then we moved to 7% inflation by the end of the year. And it is no longer transitory. Now it's a problem.
Yeah.
So hopefully with these rate hikes, that will unfortunately slow the economy a little bit, but it's for the better in the long run.
So to someone outside this field, rate hikes seem like a really bad idea. So why do you say that they're so important?
Well, it's the only tool the Fed has to curb inflation. The Fed has been very slow to raise interest rates, and I think we got to around 2.5% or so before the pandemic hit, and then they just dropped them flat, and now we're back at 0.
So in the future, if something disastrous happens again, and we're still sitting at such low interest rates, we go to negative interest rates.
That's whenever quantitative easing or the Fed's asset purchasing program kicks in, which is what they've been doing since the pandemic. But they're also going to be curbing that quantitative easing, which in turn will help curb the inflation as well.
So once again, best prospects in the future: manufacturing, distribution, data centers, and renewable energy.
You want to take those one at a time?
Sure. Seeing all the supply chain issues and the chaos over the last year, there's been a lot of talk of people pulling back offshore manufacturing and coming back to the States, made in America.
That was kind of the goal of the last administration, was to sort of bring things back to the States and have more manufacturing in the States. But as we've seen, it's kind of a half-assed attempt at it right now. And
more just assembly in the States.
I like the idea of bringing manufacturing to the States, but it's going to be incredibly expensive.
It will come back with automation. So you won't see the same number of jobs. It'll be an automated form of construction or assembly of manufacturing. But that's good. Maybe create some new robotic industries in the States.
Yeah, it's always good to innovate.
So distribution. Well, that's pretty obvious.
Amazon and other e-commerce companies have really changed the game. That has caused distribution centers and warehouses to just grow exponentially.
Data centers too. That's related to that. Big data.
It seems like everything can go back to the big tech companies, really. It's Amazon, it's Facebook, it's Google, it's Apple, it's Microsoft. Those companies, they're running the world right now.
Who have they replaced? Who were the big dogs before them?
Well, you can look back at a history of the 5 largest companies in the U.S. based on market cap, and it's interesting to see, like, back in the
like Xerox? Were they one of them?
I don't know if Xerox was, but it's like in the 1930s, like Kodak was one of the largest companies. It's pretty wild. And then you have like Sears and your early tech companies, your IBMs, your Ciscos, and Intel has come along. But now we're in this weird phase where we have just a few companies basically making all of our decisions right now. And those companies have things like cloud storage and Amazon Web Services, which is all data center related. That seems to be a growing construction niche.
Absolutely. I mean, every single app that you have on your phone, people think that they're no longer printing stuff, so they're saving the environment. They don't realize their digital footprint is much larger than what their physical footprint was.
I've always thought that would be an interesting video for you to make.
Absolutely, yeah, digital footprint.
Digital footprint and just the effects of building all these data centers all over the place.
The energy consumption of these data centers, and
also the idea of underwater data centers.
Yeah.
That seems very interesting.
And renewable energy. So we're going to see a second round of this big push towards renewable energy, and we're already seeing it. Carbon capture. So in 2008, I wasn't here in the States, but there was a lot of money invested in renewable energy. A lot of those companies failed, and all the cynics came out and saying, see, we told you so.
You want to know why that is?
Man, bear, pig?
No. You were holding on to that, weren't you? So you want to know why that is? Because in 2008, oil prices were the highest they've ever been. Here we are in 2022, oil prices are at a 7-year high, and they don't seem to be slowing down. We need to be looking for alternative forms of energy. Unfortunately...
See, this has come back to procrastination. We knew we were going to have to, but we wait until oil is expensive again to actually start looking at all these other alternatives.
It's kind of like someone working in their cubicle. Like, they're sitting in their cubicle all day and they're working. They're just sort of getting by until the boss comes around. Then they finally actually get that work in.
I feel a little bit guilty because everything we're discussing doesn't directly affect us. Inflation does. Inflation affects everyone indirectly. But we don't have employees. We don't run a construction company. Supply chain issues haven't really affected us because we haven't bought too many things out there. And I would love to get to that point where we are employing a large workforce and we have more skin in the game and we are contributing to the economy and to this country some more than we are right now. Our brother-in-law, he's a GC and he's in Texas and he's been dealing with a lot of things over the last 2 years. Labor shortages, supply chain issues, inflation, bidding on projects has been extremely difficult. And it's very tough. It's very tough for all these companies out there. And fortunately, things seem to be looking up. Like based on our interview with Ken, he gave us the indication that things are leveling off. We'll have some pullbacks, but things are looking up. So I hope you haven't been too badly affected by all these issues we've discussed in this video. Let us know what other topics you'd like us to explore. Join us next week for another episode on building science, products, and technology. See ya.